The GPS flickered twice, then guided a heavy horse trailer down a narrow, rutted dirt road that cut through a wide expanse of Montana prairie. The rig rolled slow, dust trailing off the tires, and the driver, Frank Miles, glanced again at the delivery manifest as if the paper might rearrange itself and reveal the truth. The address printed on the form said Metobrook Ranch, an upscale-sounding destination that implied immaculate arenas and manicured paddocks, but the landscape unfolding ahead was the opposite of pomp and polish. Instead of grand stables and show ring lights, a modest cluster of weathered buildings came into view, a faded wooden sign hanging from a bent post announcing Metobrook Healing Stables, in paint that had long ago surrendered to the sun. A handful of small paddocks hugged a converted barn, and beyond them a tapestry of sagebrush and distant hills stretched to the horizon. In the yard, an elderly woman with sun-leathered skin and overalls splattered with mud led a miniature pony, the simple scene a different kind of beauty. The driver grunted and pulled the truck to a stop beside the barn, tension tightening across his shoulders. The woman introduced herself as Dorothy Mallister, 71, and approached with measured curiosity, that gentle combination of skepticism and hospitality that comes from a lifetime of welcoming animals and families through a humble gate. She asked, voice matching the slow rhythm of the country air. The man pointed to the paperwork and explained that a premium gelding named Midnight's Verdict was listed for delivery to Metobrook Ranch, priced like a top-tier show jumper and accompanied by instructions that the animal be accepted without delay. Dorothy's eyes widened behind thick lenses when the name and valuation were mentioned. She insisted, with a soft certainty, that this was the wrong Metobrook, that this place focused on therapeutic riding for children with special needs, and was not the high-end facility Frank's documents described. She suggested the intended destination might be Metobrook Estates, 40 miles north. Frank's jaw tightened. The truck's transmission had been sounding off for miles, the sun was sliding toward the horizon, and his employer had been adamant that the horse be delivered in that county before nightfall. Paperwork, he reminded her, tied this animal to the address on the form. Once the horse was off the trailer, the next steps would not be his problem. Before Dorothy could request proof or argue further, Frank swung the trailer door open, the air inside smelling faintly of hay and equine musk. From the dim interior stepped the most impressive horse Dorothy had ever stood beside. Midnight's Verdict was enormous and noble, a 17-hand Warmblood with a coat the color of polished obsidian. His musculature hinted at elite breeding. The line of his neck, the slope of his shoulders, the solid power in his hindquarters all spoke of breeding and training, and a life shaped for the competition ring. Yet while the outward picture matched the papers, his eyes told another story. They were hollowed and dull, the brightness of spirit replaced by a weary, vacant look that made Dorothy's chest ache. Old pressure marks around the mouth betrayed the regular presence of a harsh bit. His shoulders carried the posture of an animal resigned to orders, not the alert, responsive carriage of a champion. When Dorothy touched his flank, the skin felt tight and he seemed to stand heavy, as if the world had worn him down. Frank handed her a thick stack of documents while preparing to leave, shrugging a sort of finality into the moment as if signing something off with a last-minute shrug. The envelope contained a paper trail that read like an indictment of failed expectations. Midnight's Verdict had been sold and returned 3 times in the previous 8 months. Notes from trainers and buyers used blunt phrases. Refuses to jump, unpredictable behavior, dangerous for competitive riding. A trainer had written simply, beautiful horse, broken spirit, recommend retirement or sale for non-performance purposes. The most jarring detail was not the dollar sign attached to the animal, but the string of rejections and the language that implied he had been broken, pushed beyond a limit that left him unable to perform and unwilling to try. Alone with the horse after Frank's truck rumbled away, Dorothy felt the scale of the problem and the smallness of her own operation. Metobrook Healing Stables ran on modest donations, community support, and an unending reserve of stubborn kindness. The farm's program served children for whom horses were tools of connection, places of calm, partners in therapy rather than props in a show ring. The idea that such a valuable animal might already be classified as useless in the eyes of his former handlers caused a quiet fury to rise in Dorothy. That night, Dorothy called the number listed for the horse's owner and left a message, explaining the mistake and offering to keep the horse until the situation could be sorted. The response 3 days later came from an assistant named Patricia, who spoke with the kind of breathless efficiency learned in corporate offices. The owner, Sterling Moore, was overseas and undecided about whether to place the horse in retirement or attempt a sale. Until he made that decision, he said, the horse could remain where he was so long as no harm came to him. The animal's care would be covered by insurance and a trust. With that conditional permission, Midnight's verdict stayed. The first person who truly assessed his condition was Dorothy's granddaughter, Olivia, a 28-year-old occupational therapist who managed the therapeutic programs and paid attention to the little clinical signs professionals notice. Reading the paperwork and watching the horse in person, Olivia tracked a pattern that explained what was visible. The gelding had likely been pushed too hard, too young, subjected to aversive training methods that suppressed his natural responsiveness and left him in a state that resembled what a human clinician would call post-traumatic stress. The animal's exterior remained magnificent, but the interior had contracted into a shell of compliance that felt like resignation rather than training. For a week after arrival, the horse ate, drank, and moved with the economy of an animal with a discontinued spark. No one attempted to ride him or to force him into work. The team at Metobrook left him room, time, and a quiet presence, trying to keep the routine predictable and free from the kind of pressure that had broken him. That choice opened a door. A 9-year-old therapy student named Wesley, non-verbal most of the time and living with autism, wandered from his usual schedule and quietly approached Midnight's verdict's paddock. Wesley had never been seen moving unaccompanied toward a full-sized horse before, and Dorothy's lungs tightened as the boy scaled a low rail and met the animal face to face. The encounter unfolded without drama. Midnight's verdict lowered his head until his muzzle met Wesley's small palm and the boy's fingers rested on the horse's nose. Neither flinched. The two stood like an unspoken treaty, perfectly still. After 5 minutes, Wesley spoke with a level tone that carried less shock than truth. "You're sad. I get sad too, but it's okay here." The statement landed like a soft bell. When Wesley walked back to his grandmother's waiting arms, he smiled in a way his mother later described as a rare light that had been missing from his days. For the first time since arrival, the horse's eyes showed more than emptiness. Olivia watched, clinically curious yet emotionally moved. She recorded notes and video and began to propose an emerging hypothesis. The horse was responding to the children not because they could train him through expertise, but because they brought no agenda. Interaction with the kids was not corrective or performance-driven. It was presence without demand, and it allowed the horse to practice being an animal again instead of a machine. Word of that quiet connection grew into a commitment. Dorothy asked the owner to consider letting the horse stay for a little while longer to see if there was progress to be made. The assistant agreed to a temporary arrangement, and so Midnight's verdict settled into a slow rehabilitation built not on repetition of dressage exercises, but on small acts of companionship. Days expanded like pages in a long, deliberate book. A child with cerebral palsy sat beside him and read aloud, fingers trailing across a page while the horse stood still and patient. An anxious teenager came and groomed his mane for 20 quiet minutes, the repetitive motions stabilizing both hands and heartbeat. A boy with Down syndrome taught the horse a simple game of touching colored cones with his nose. None of these were training tasks in the competition sense. Instead, they were invitations to participate, voluntary and gentle. Olivia documented everything with the discipline of a clinician and the curiosity of someone who believed in the possibility of recovery. She kept notes on behavioral shifts, on the way the horse lifted his head a fraction more often, on the softening of the jaw, on micro-expressions of alertness that might have been missed by those seeking only arena-ready performance. Week by week, the horse's presence changed. It was incremental and sometimes reversible in a single bad night, but the overall slope moved toward a wake. On the 28th day, Dorothy walked out to the paddock and found Midnight's Verdict doing something she had not witnessed since the delivery. He trotted the soft earth with a kind of looseness, tossing his head, rearing playfully in the way sons of the pasture do when joy momentarily returns. When he saw Dorothy, he nudged her shoulder with his muzzle. The contact felt like a greeting, a reclamation of relationship instead of command. That afternoon the phone rang and Sterling Moore, the horse's owner, called personally for the first time. He spoke with the crisp bluntness of someone who lived by balance sheets and expected returns. He intended to send Midnight's Verdict to a retirement farm in Virginia and would arrange transport the following week. Dorothy's answer was calm and firm. The horse had begun to recover, she explained, and the facility had barely enough resources to maintain its current caseload. Moore was unmoved by sentiment. To him, the horse was a depreciated asset that had failed to meet its projected performance. He saw no reason to delay a sale or retirement for something that would not return to its former market value. Dorothy asked for a visit instead, requesting that he see the progress with his own eyes, not as a plea but as an invitation to consider a different kind of outcome. Sterling Moore accepted the visit a few days later, arriving in clothes and a car that signaled an unfamiliarity with dirt and a life routinely calculated in margins. He watched as a therapy session unfolded in the riding arena, where several children, supervised and guided, moved with Midnight's Verdict through gentle activities that involved no saddle and no pressure. The horse stood in the middle of the group like a lighthouse and acted not as a competitor, but as an anchor. He moved when asked with an almost tender compliance and offered spontaneous, helpful behaviors. Retrieving a dropped ball for Wesley, nudging a cone closer for a child who could not reach, allowing a girl to lie beneath his belly during a stretching exercise and then remaining supremely still. Moments that would have been dismissed as untrained at a show were, at Metobrook, miracles of willingness. Watching those interactions changed something in Moore. When left alone with the horse, without the soundtrack of a session and the need to observe economics, he stepped into the paddock expecting the same resistance that had defined past transactions. Instead, the colt approached and rested his head against Moore's chest, like a human leaning into trust. Moore emerged altered by that small gesture of faith. His posture loosened, and his focus narrowed from ledger lines to the living, breathing animal at his hand. The calculation that had once measured the horse solely in prize money shifted toward a recognition of value that could not be totaled in dollars. Overnight negotiations began to take a different tone. Moore proposed a solution that blended ownership with compassion, an endowment that would cover the horse's care for the rest of his life, plus a stipend to help support the facility that had facilitated the transformation. Dorothy, pragmatic and realistic about funding, accepted the offer with gratitude and a cautious relief. Paperwork took its time to finalize, as such arrangements always do, but by mid-September, Midnight's Verdict had a new legal identity as a resident of Metobrook Healing Stables, funded by a trust established by his former owner. The money eased logistical pressures, but the real work remained in daily interactions, in steady routines that asked little and required patience like sunlight that eventually warms what was cold. The horse became a central presence in the therapeutic program, his particular temperament especially suited to children who needed a stable, non-judgmental companion. He adjusted his behavior to meet the moment. Calm and grounding for a child needing stability, playful and interactive for one craving engagement, quietly attentive for a student practicing focus. Outcomes were tangible over months. Wesley, who had first opened the door to the horse's recovery, began to speak more often and in more contexts than before, his teachers reporting improved communication and regulation. Parents described small home victories, like sleeping alone or tackling a difficult task without meltdown, framed as progress built out of the child's time with the patient horse. A teen battling anxiety reported fewer panic attacks after weeks of being near midnight's verdict. A girl with cerebral palsy gained confidence in the strength of her body after repeated sessions of gentle interaction and supported mounting maneuvers. Referrals came from therapists in nearby counties who had heard about the unusual yet effective approach, patient, permission-based interaction rather than performance-driven correction. Sterling Moore returned twice over the following months, witnessing, in one visit, his own daughter take 2 hours to sit with the horse and begin to speak about feelings she had kept private. Each visit rearranged Moore's priorities a little more. He wrote later that buying the horse for victory in rings had felt like a sensible choice at the time. What the horse offered instead, connection, calm, the ability to teach people how to live with softness, was something not anticipated on a balance sheet. For Dorothy and Olivia, the daily routine continued with renewed rhythm. The money helped with feed bills and vet care and allowed the shelter to serve more children, but the intangible benefits were the ones most often recounted in quiet moments. The sight of a child running toward the paddock with unguarded joy, the sound of laughter that once seemed distant, the subtle relaxations in shoulders that had been locked by fear. Midnight's verdict, the horse once declared broken, now carried a different kind of prestige. He no longer measured worth by ribbons, but by the number of times a child learned to trust, by the steadying presence he offered on hard days, and by the simple acts of cooperation that taught small people about giving and receiving care. Press inquiries followed, and members of the equestrian community wanted to know what technique had turned a failed jumper into a therapeutic star. The answer was simple and stubbornly unglamorous: patience, acceptance, and the removal of pressure. There was no secret method to sell as a formula. The work was ordinary, repetitive, and relational. It asked people to sit, to be present, to allow an animal to choose and to trust. As winter came and painted the farm and the hills in white, Dorothy often stood at the paddock fence watching Midnight's verdict move among other therapy horses. The horse that had arrived hollow changed into one who approached each morning with curiosity and a readiness to join whatever quiet ritual the day required. He learned to accept children in the range of their needs and to adapt without coercion. Dorothy watched Wesley teaching the horse a new game one late afternoon and observed something like a miracle in the mundane. A boy once shut down, now animatedly instructing a massive animal how to touch a sequence of cones, both of them engaged in play and partnership. The old driver who had dropped Midnight's verdict off by mistake had been right about one thing. The facility had not been what the paperwork described, but the error that had once seemed catastrophic had morphed into a gift. The wrong address had brought a horse to a place that could hear him, and in turn the animal gave back something unexpected and profound. The local equestrian world and neighboring therapeutic programs took notice, not because the horse had performed in a new ring, but because outcomes in human lives shifted in visible, hopeful ways. People called asking about methods, not to replicate a formula, but to understand the humility of an approach that refused to make an animal prove its worth by old measures. The story traveled quietly, first through word of mouth and local columns, then through longer pieces in magazines that liked narratives of heart and repair. but the essence of the tale never required press attention to be true. A magnificent animal, labeled as broken, learned to be whole again when surrounded by people who valued his company more than his output. In the end, the most powerful transformation was not financial or reputational. It was the simple human and animal work of showing up and being steady. The horse that had been rejected 3 times and declared unfit for the ring found a place where acceptance replaced instruction, and where a community of children and caregivers offered him a role he could fulfill without pain. Some mistakes, as Dorothy often said while watching a sunset settle across Montana fields, are really just deliveries of new beginnings that arrived wrapped in confusion. The driver who pulled down the wrong dirt track had thought he was following orders, but the resulting outcome belonged to something larger than logistics. Midnight's verdict found a purpose that no ribbon could measure, and that purpose returned to the children in smiles, in sleep, in brave steps forward they might not otherwise have taken. If this tale of unexpected healing touched the heart, consider subscribing to the channel that brings such stories into the world. Leave a like to help this message travel to someone who needs to feel hope, and share the video with a friend who believes in second chances and in the quiet power of showing up for one another.